They slammed those posts into the ground at 4 in the morning. I heard the pounding against the earth and thought it was just a wild dream or maybe an early construction project somewhere in the neighborhood. But no, when the sun finally broke over the horizon, I pulled back my bedroom curtain and nearly dropped my coffee. There it was, a brand new wooden fence slicing straight through the middle of my yard, running from one end of my property to the other like a jarring scar. My heart pounded and my jaw clenched. It was the kind of sight that could jolt even the calmest person into a rage. At first I refused to believe my eyes. I'd lived in Willow Bend, a quiet suburban town just outside Denver, for nearly a decade. My yard was modest but well kept, a green patch I'd turned into a miniature oasis. I cherished the sight of my dog Chester, bounding across that grass, chasing after tennis balls. I relished the smell of those flower beds I'd planted for my late mother, her favorite marigolds and daisies blooming every spring. Now the yard looked like a war zone, a battleground of torn-up turf and wooden panels hammered into place without my permission. For a long moment I stood there in shock, heart thumping in my chest, cold fury washing over me. I rushed outside, nearly tripping over a pile of uprooted grass and muddy footprints. The fence's height was easily 6 feet, brand new, cedar boards that reeked of fresh lumber. A set of nails jutted out from each panel. The workers had apparently left in a hurry, maybe hoping no one would notice before dawn. The fence wasn't just an eyesore, it was an act of blatant trespass. It took up nearly a quarter of my yard, effectively carving out a chunk of my land as though it belonged to someone else. I couldn't fathom who had the audacity to do this, or why they imagined they'd get away with it. It didn't take long to find out. While I stood there, eyes still bleary from lack of sleep, a neighbor ambled over to the edge of my driveway. Her name was Carla, a kind soul who usually walked her golden retriever around this time, but she looked rattled, shoulders tense, eyes wide. She raised a hand in a tentative wave. "Have you seen what the HOA did?" she asked breathlessly. "I heard them out here before dawn. They said they were installing an authorized perimeter fence." She hesitated. Something about her expression told me she had more to say. "They did the same thing at Tom's place down the street last month. Claimed it was part of a land usage expansion they'd approved." My blood boiled as I processed her words. The Willow Bend Homeowners Association had pulled a lot of stunts in recent years. Nonsense about mailbox colors, lawn ornament regulations, even restrictions on the types of cars that could be parked in driveways. Yet none of those petty rules came close to the brazen invasion of constructing a fence on private property in the dead of night. I thanked Carla, my mind already spinning with possibilities. I wasn't about to let them get away with this, and they had no idea whom they were tangling with. I kept my profession a secret from most of my neighbors. I preferred a low profile. When I first moved here, I learned that some folks became uneasy if they knew I was a top-tier land-using attorney who'd litigated multi-million-dollar disputes in Colorado courts. In fact, I'd earned a bit of a reputation among certain real estate developers who found my knack for winning downright terrifying. I specialized in unraveling complicated property rights cases, and I had zero tolerance for underhanded tactics. But I never used my job to intimidate my neighbors. I wanted a quiet life, free from the swirl of legal drama I handled at work. Unfortunately, the Willow Bend HOA had just forced my hand. Moments later, I noticed an official letter tucked into my mailbox. I snatched it out, my stomach twisting in anger as I read the HOA's letterhead. It was short, just a few terse lines stating that, per a newly approved boundary adjustment, the HOA was installing a perimeter fence that would enhance property values and promote uniform aesthetics within the community. They congratulated me on my contribution to the improvement of the neighborhood. At the bottom, in small print, I saw the name and signature of Ms. Linda Cole, the newly elected president of the Willow Bend HOA. That name rang a bell. Linda Cole had made waves over the past 6 months. She'd replaced the former, more lenient HOA president after a contentious election. Rumors flew about how Ms. Cole was determined to reshape Willow Bend according to her own strict vision, ignoring any personal property nuances if it suited her plan. Some neighbors grumbled that she possessed the cunning of a seasoned politician and the cutthroat instincts of a big city developer. Now, apparently she believed she could slice away a portion of my yard without consequence. I reread the letter, eyebrows knitting together, noticing the language about a boundary adjustment. They claimed a newly resurveyed line gave the HOA rights to the strip of land that used to be part of my yard. What boundary adjustment? I hissed through gritted teeth. And how did they approve it without my knowledge? My heart pounded. The shadows in my yard seemed darker than before. Without losing a moment, I stalked back inside, rummaging through my living room's wooden desk for the official deed and survey map I'd received when I bought the place. I found the papers, spread them out across my kitchen table, and studied them with the practiced eye of someone who spent years dissecting land plots. My property lines were clearly marked, and the fence, as installed, definitely intruded upon my territory by at least 10 feet, possibly more. And yet, the HOA letter insisted the boundary had changed. That meant they'd either bribed someone at the county assessor's office, or they'd found a legal loophole that allowed them to push that fence line deeper into my property. Either way, my blood boiled. I put in a quick call to the county land records department to see if anything official had changed regarding the property lines. The clerk sounded perplexed when I described the situation and promised to investigate. While I waited, I glanced out my window, watching a pair of birds flit across the fence. How many other neighbors were dealing with this intrusion? If Ms. Cole had orchestrated a scheme to snatch bits and pieces of private yards, that spelled trouble not just for me, but for the entire community. My phone buzzed and the clerk came back on the line, voice trembling. I can't find any updated survey data that would justify the fence being placed where it is, she said hesitantly. No newly recorded boundary changes, it's all the same as it was when you purchased the property. That was enough proof to set my plan into motion. I would gather evidence, confront the HOA, and if necessary drag them into court. My heart hammered with anticipation. A cold determination coursed through my veins. This was my land, and they had absolutely no right to reclaim it for their so-called perimeter fence. But I knew better than to blow up in anger. Instead, I'd do what I always did in my cases. Meticulously gather every shred of evidence, line up my arguments, and strike at the perfect moment. I hopped into my truck and drove to the Willow Bend Community Center, where the HOA kept its main office. The place was closed, but I spotted Miss Cole's Prius parked out front, so I guessed she was inside. I tried the door, found it locked, and knocked firmly. My pulse quickened as footsteps approached. Sure enough, Miss Cole opened the door just enough to peek out. She was in her early 40s with a sharp bob haircut, neatly pressed blazer, and a pair of cold, watchful eyes. She recognized me immediately. An uneasy flicker danced across her face. We're not open to the public right now, she said curtly. You can come back during business hours, or send an email. I forced a polite smile, though my anger churned inside. You built a fence through my yard this morning. I'd say that qualifies as urgent. She glanced over her shoulder as though making sure no one else was around, then stepped outside, closing the door behind her. This was a board-approved action, she said, pressing her lips together. We've been planning it for months. I'm sorry if you weren't informed, but the board has the authority to manage the neighborhood's perimeter in accordance with our covenants. I arched an eyebrow. Perimeter? My property is not community land. I have the deed, the original survey that I got at closing, and the county clerk sees no changes on record. A glimmer of annoyance crossed her features. We have updated records that show a shift in the boundary. It's perfectly legitimate. Maybe you just haven't kept up with recent amendments. I leaned in slightly, letting my voice drop. I keep up with everything about my property, Miss Cole. I have a phone call into the county assessor's office. They claim there's no record of any shift. So, what exactly are you referencing? She pursed her lips, a faint flush creeping up her neck. The HOA has a legal right to expand our community's perimeter for security purposes, especially when certain lots remain in question. If the county clerk's office hasn't processed the official boundary realignment, that's hardly our fault. We have a signed agreement with the developer that originally planned Willow Bend's layout. Some old disclaimers might have lingered in the documents. This fence is about uniformity, and the board voted unanimously to proceed. I could tell she was making it up as she went, weaving half-truths. My instincts screamed that Miss Cole was counting on the complexity of land use laws to shield her from immediate blowback. She probably assumed I'd be too overwhelmed by legal jargon to question her. With a steady breath, I nodded. Fine. Then you won't mind producing that official survey for me. I'd like to review it. After all, if your realignment is legitimate, it should be on record, right? She stammered slightly. We're still processing the final version. It'll be available soon. Soon? I echoed, letting a hint of challenge color my tone. I'm sure you understand how important it is for me to verify something that physically alters my property. I'll give you 2 days to produce the official documents. If I don't have them by then, I'll assume there's no legal justification for that fence. Her gaze hardened. You can take it up with the HOA's legal counsel. But you won't get anywhere. We've already consulted with them and we're well within our rights to secure the perimeter. I forced a calm smile, heart hammering. Thank you for your time, I said icily, walking away. I didn't want to tip my hand just yet. She might have recognized me as a neighbor, but she had no idea about my background as a high-powered land attorney. If she thought I was just some clueless homeowner, all the better for me. I intended to gather everything I needed before dropping that bombshell. I returned home, snapping photos of the fence from every angle, measuring precisely how many feet it encroached on my property. Then, I documented the damage they'd done. Ripped up flower beds, severed sprinkler lines, even the portion of my yard my dog used for running. In legal fights, details are everything. My phone buzzed. It was Carla again. Did you talk to Miss Cole? She asked, anxiety thick in her voice. She's been giving everyone the runaround. I told Carla I'd spoken with Ms. Cole briefly. Carla sighed. You know Tom, right? He tried to fight them when they fenced off part of his backyard last month. But Tom's older and doesn't have the means to hire a lawyer, so he just gave up. The HOA threatened to fine him for obstructing their lawful construction if he took down the fence. I think it broke his spirit. He's been depressed ever since. That was all the confirmation I needed. Ms. Cole and her board were systematically encroaching on private yards, taking advantage of homeowners who couldn't easily mount a legal defense. Something in my chest twisted at the thought of vulnerable neighbors feeling trapped. I felt a surge of righteous anger. This wasn't just about my yard anymore. It was about standing up for the entire community. I arranged to meet Tom the next day, wanting to see the fence they'd built through his yard. He lived a few blocks over in a cozy ranch-style house. His backyard was even smaller than mine, and sure enough, the fence took a sizable chunk, severing his vegetable garden. Tom, a retired widower, apologized for the mess as we walked around, but I assured him there was no need. I noticed the fence bore the same style fresh cedar boards, hammered into the ground. The frustration in Tom's eyes spoke volumes. They told me, Tom said in a shaky voice, that my yard was always part of the neighborhood's greenbelt, that I'd been using it illegally for years, but they never enforced it until now. And the developer apparently gave them permission. I didn't know what else to do. I laid a hand on his shoulder. Tom, do you have any documents from when you bought the house? The deed, survey, anything that shows your property lines? He nodded weakly. It's in a box somewhere. I never planned on rummaging through it. Figured the HOA must know what they're doing. My gut twisted with empathy. I understand. But they're counting on that attitude to get away with this. Would you let me look at those papers if you find them? He hesitated for half a second, but a glimmer of hope sparked in his eyes. Sure. If it helps me get my yard back, I'm willing. I left Tom's place more determined than ever. Ms. Cole was wading into dangerous territory if she was forging or manipulating property lines. Once I had enough evidence of wrongdoing, falsified survey documents or contradictory official records, I'd blow this wide open. But I needed to be strategic, or else the HOA might bury me and my neighbors in endless bureaucratic nonsense. That evening, I worked my contacts, Over the years, I'd built relationships with county surveyors, environmental consultants, and even real estate investigators. I made a few phone calls, carefully explaining the situation in broad terms. An HOA claiming a boundary realignment that the county had no record of. My sources promised to dig deeper. Meanwhile, I combed through the Willow Bend covenants and restrictions, the thick binder I'd received when I first moved here. It spelled out in excruciating detail the color of shutters I was allowed to install, the maximum height of hedges, and so on. Yet nowhere did it say the HOA could unilaterally move a fence line onto my land. My phone rang late that night. It was an old colleague, Sarah, who worked in city planning. She'd pulled up the original subdivision maps. "You're correct," she said. "There's no mention of any boundary that includes your yard as part of a community perimeter. It's entirely your land. If the HOA's fence is on it, they're in violation. I suspect the developer might have made some side agreement with the HOA leadership, but it wouldn't override official county records." I thanked her, my heart humming with certainty. So Miss Cole must be banking on some half-baked legal angle or downright trickery to get around the official maps. Or she believed that no one would bother verifying. I closed my eyes, summoning every bit of discipline. I'd handle this by the book, gathering an ironclad case. Then, I'd deliver the news in the most public, devastating way possible. The next day, while I was in my garage sorting old boxes for more documents, a black SUV rolled up my driveway. The tinted window lowered, revealing a man in a stiff gray suit. He had the smug aura of someone who believed his time was more valuable than anyone else's. Opening the car door, he climbed out and extended a business card without so much as a greeting. "I'm Daniel Cooper," he said tersely, "legal counsel for the Willow Bend Homeowners Association. My client, Miss Cole, informs me you've been making demands about the new fence." I took the card, forcing neutrality onto my face. "I'm just asserting my property rights," I said simply. He adjusted his tie. "Your property rights are not absolute. If the HOA has a valid claim, I strongly advise you to cease any attempt to remove or damage the newly installed fence. Otherwise, you'll face steep fines, possible civil liability, even a criminal trespass charge if you hamper a lawful boundary line." I narrowed my eyes, noting the arrogance in his tone. So this was their strategy: intimidation. "I assure you," I replied quietly, "I have no intention of damaging the fence. But if it's on my land illegally, it's coming down sooner or later, along with any bogus claim your client thinks she has." He sniffed, as though amused. "I see. You might want to think carefully before going to war against the HOA. They have more resources and time than you can imagine." He lifted a brow. "Are you sure you want to play that game?" A flicker of satisfaction welled inside me. Clearly, Ms. Cole had no idea who I really was, or she never would have sent this pawn to threaten me. I refused to respond with aggression. Instead, I looked him square in the eye. "I appreciate the warning, Mr. Cooper," I said calmly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have business to attend to." He smirked, then slipped back into his SUV. As he drove off, I allowed myself a quiet chuckle. This was exactly how I'd seen unscrupulous land grabbers operate in my professional life. Use intimidation and legal posturing to scare away opposition before it started. They had no clue they were dealing with someone who'd spent years demolishing these kinds of arguments in court. Within the following days, I spoke with more neighbors, including a young couple who'd just moved in last winter. They explained that Ms. Cole had approached them with a friendly heads-up about an upcoming fence project that would cut across the back corner of their yard. She'd assured them it was standard procedure and that the HOA had all the documentation in order. Terrified of being singled out or fined, they didn't contest it. Their once spacious backyard was now cramped, with a quarter of the lawn effectively sealed off. One by one, stories trickled in. Residents complaining about how Ms. Cole either threatened them or dangled promises of future beautification in exchange for compliance. A pattern emerged. The HOA would announce some vague boundary realignment or improvement, claiming it was for security or aesthetics, then move fences further into private land. They'd do it quietly or, in my case, in the middle of the night. Many residents didn't realize they had the legal right to fight back, or they felt too intimidated to try. That realization fueled my resolve. I wasn't just doing this for myself, I was doing it for everyone who'd been bullied or tricked by the HOA. Finally, after a week of extensive research, I compiled enough evidence to sink the entire fence project. I had my original deed, the county's official property line records, witness statements from neighbors, and even a note from the city planning office confirming no official boundary shift had been approved. The icing on the cake was a leaked email thread I received anonymously, presumably from a disillusioned HOA board member, indicating Ms. Cole was fast-tracking the fence installation before the county could verify anything. The email spelled out her worry that if homeowners find out there's no legal basis, they'll fight us. The moral lines were clear. Ms. Cole knew exactly what she was doing. On a cool Thursday evening, the HOA hosted a monthly meeting at the community center, open to all residents. Typically, these gatherings were dull affairs where board members argued about landscaping budgets or the color scheme for holiday decorations. But this time, rumors had spread that something big was brewing, that I, among others, was going to challenge the fence. The room buzzed with tension as I walked in. At least 30 residents were seated in fold-out chairs, murmuring anxiously. Ms. Cole stood at the head of the room next to a podium, flanked by a few board members. She forced a tight smile at me, but I could see the tension in her jaw. The meeting kicked off with a routine reading of last month's minutes, then a short update on various minor projects. Everyone was fidgety. It was obvious that the real drama lay ahead. Finally, Ms. Cole cleared her throat. "We'll now open the floor to any new business," she announced, voice tight. "If you have a concern or item to discuss, please state your name and address for the record, then proceed." I stood, letting the moment stretch out just enough to raise the tension. "My name is Grant Davis," I said. "I live on Aspen Way. I'd like to address the unauthorized fence the HOA installed through my yard last week." A hush fell over the room. Ms. Cole tensed, adjusting her blazer. "Yes, Mr. Davis," she said with a practiced composure. "I believe you spoke to me about that. As I mentioned, the HOA has every right to build within the property lines that belong to the community. If you have confusion about the boundary, our council would be happy to clarify." I exhaled slowly, as though trying to remain calm. "I see. And you have documentation supporting this claim, right?" She nodded sharply. "We do. It's being finalized. The developer's agreement with the original survey outlines the perimeter land as part of the Willow Bend community property. We're well within our rights." She lifted her chin. "I'm sorry if that conflicts with your personal belief about where your yard ends." The tension in the room was palpable. A few neighbors shifted uncomfortably, while others stared at me with desperate hope. I fished a folder from my briefcase. "Interesting," I said, letting a hint of amusement creep into my tone. "Because I have documentation that tells a very different story." Miss Cole's eyes narrowed, but she kept her tone dismissive. "Is that so?" "Yes," I continued, stepping forward to the table at the front. "First, my deed, which clearly states the dimensions of my property. Second, a statement from the county assessor's office that no boundary changes have been recorded. Third, a letter from the city planning department confirming that Willow Bend's officially recognized perimeter does not include the portion of my yard you fenced off. Fourth, and I find this particularly enlightening, an email from your personal account, Ms. Cole, referencing an attempt to fast-track fence installations before the county can verify the boundary lines." I let the hush of the room deepen. Then, I laid the printed email on the table. A ripple of shock coursed through the audience. Miss Cole's face flamed red. That's private correspondence," she snapped, though her voice faltered. "This is a breach." "I also have statements from 3 different neighbors," I said, ignoring her protest, "who were coerced into surrendering their yards based on similar false claims, and a lovely record of fines your board has threatened to levy if they dared protest. Now, Ms. Cole, If you have legitimate proof that the HOA owns these lands, by all means, show it to us. But I suspect no such documentation exists." Mrs. Cole stared at me with a mixture of rage and panic. The entire room crackled with tension. Finally, she sputtered, "This is a matter for the HOA's legal counsel to handle. We will not debate these issues in a public forum." That was my cue. With deliberate calm, I introduced the final piece of the puzzle. "Actually, Ms. Cole, I happen to be quite familiar with debating property issues. Let me formally introduce myself. I'm Grant Davis, Senior Land Attorney for Hartwell and Grace. I specialize in real estate litigation and land use disputes." I paused. Her face went ashen as she realized the significance of my words, and I've encountered too many HOAs that try to bully homeowners with baseless claims. "Let me assure you, I'll be filing for a court injunction first thing tomorrow morning to have this fence removed, not just from my property but from any property in Willow Bend where it's been unlawfully placed. Furthermore, I'll be requesting an investigation into whether you or others on this board knowingly falsified documents to manipulate property lines." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Ms. Cole's mouth hung open for a second before she forced it shut. The other board members looked stunned, clearly taken aback by the sudden shift in power. Some neighbors broke into subdued applause, while others exchanged looks of relief and excitement. In that single moment, Miss Cole's carefully crafted intimidation tactics started unraveling. She tried to maintain control, glancing at her board. We'll convene an emergency executive session to discuss this matter," she said, voice trembling. "This meeting is adjourned." But as soon as she slammed the gavel, half the room erupted with questions. Many neighbors rushed forward to ask me about the legal details. Miss Cole practically fled out a side door with her board in tow. I felt a surge of satisfaction, yet a calmer voice in my head reminded me that the real fight was just beginning. She wasn't likely to surrender quietly. People with her level of ambition and cunning rarely did. After the meeting, a small group gathered around me, including Tom, Carla, and the young couple. Relief washed over their faces. "We've been dealing with this for months," one neighbor said. "I had no idea we had the right to fight them." I smiled gently. "Trust me, you do. I'll do everything in my power to see that fence removed and your property rights restored. My only request is that if you have any documents, photos, or other evidence, get them to me. The more proof we have, the less wiggle room Ms. Cole has. And if any of you face harassment or intimidation from the HOA, let me know immediately." They nodded eagerly. Tom gripped my hand, tears in his eyes. "Thank you, Grant. I thought I'd have to spend the rest of my days looking at that fence in my garden." My heart clenched with compassion. "We'll get your garden back, Tom. Count on it." True to my word, the next morning I drafted a formal complaint. I requested a temporary injunction to halt any further fence construction in Willow Bend and to have the existing fences removed until a court could determine their legality. My phone rang off the hook. Neighbors calling to share stories or express gratitude, colleagues offering their assistance pro bono if necessary. I was fired up. The community was rallying and Ms. Cole's facade of authority was collapsing. That afternoon, I marched into the county courthouse, my complaint in hand. The staff recognized me. I'd argued numerous high-profile cases here, and they moved to expedite the filing. I couldn't help but feel a thrill at seeing Miss Cole's smug illusions crumble. She had bet everything on her assumption that nobody would challenge her. Now she was about to face the full force of a legal system that didn't appreciate manipulation. In less than 24 hours, Ms. Cole and the HOA board were served with the complaint, along with a notice that a judge would be reviewing my request for a temporary restraining order against any further fence expansion. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. My plan was straightforward. Present the official deeds, the county records, the neighbors' statements, and that damning email chain. I was confident the judge would see how the HOA had overstepped its bounds, literally and figuratively. I wasn't naive, though. I knew Miss Cole would try everything, discredit my witnesses, produce bogus documents, maybe even claim the developer's original plans gave them carte blanche. But I'd handled worse in my career. The truth was on my side. A few days later, I received a letter from Mr. Cooper, the HOA's attorney, filled with condescending language about how they looked forward to defending their rights in court. I smiled grimly. Let them come. The day of the hearing arrived. The small courtroom hummed with tension. Neighbors filled the gallery benches, their expressions a mix of hope and anxiety. Ms. Cole sat at the defendant's table with 2 board members and Mr. Cooper. I took my place at the plaintiff's table, accompanied by an associate from my law firm who volunteered to assist. The judge, an older woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, scanned the docket. "All right," she said, "Davis versus Willow Bend Homeowners Association. Let's proceed." I laid out my case systematically, presenting the official property line records first, then the direct comparisons to the fence's location. I cited the relevant Colorado statutes that protect private property owners from encroachment, even by HOAs. Then I introduced the neighbors' affidavits, detailing how Ms. Cole threatened fines and other punishments if they resisted. The judge's expression remained neutral, but she asked a few pointed questions that told me she was paying close attention. Finally, I produced the email chain. I read aloud the part where Ms. Cole explicitly mentioned wanting to install fences quickly, before anyone from the county can catch wind. A ripple of shock went through the gallery, and Ms. Cole's face turned crimson. She looked like she was about to explode, but Mr. Cooper waved her down, determined to maintain composure. When I finished, Mr. Cooper rose to present their defense. Predictably, he argued the HOA was operating under an old land agreement that gave them the right to restore the neighborhood boundaries as originally intended by the developer. But when the judge pressed him to produce the official survey reflecting that boundary, all he could provide was a questionable map with no county seal, dated after Miss Cole became president. It looked like someone had simply redrawn the lines. The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. Miss Cole tried to speak, her voice trembling with indignation. "Your Honor, we only did what was in the best interest of the community. People have been encroaching on what is technically communal land for years, and we're trying to maintain uniform standards. This is about safety and preserving property values." The judge peered down at her. "Mr. Cole, if this was above board, why the secrecy? Why install the fences at 4 in the morning? Why threaten homeowners with fines if your position was legally sound?" Ms. Cole faltered, unable to give a convincing answer. The judge then asked Mr. Cooper about the email mentioning the fast-tracking plan. He tried to spin it as a misunderstanding, but the judge had heard enough. She granted my request for a temporary restraining order, forcing the HOA to cease all fencing activities. She also indicated that, based on the evidence, she was strongly inclined to rule that the fence was illegally placed. We were given a few weeks for final hearings and potential mediation, but the writing was on the wall. Miss Cole's fence gambit was doomed. Cheers erupted in the courtroom hallway as neighbors flooded around me, thanking me. Carla dabbed at tears of relief. Tom beamed with a joy I hadn't seen in him before. Even strangers who'd just heard about the case on social media came up to shake my hand. Miss Cole and her board slunk out a side exit, flanked by Mr. Cooper, whose expression was grim. That evening, local news stations picked up the story. A reporter interviewed me in front of the partially dismantled fence in my yard, cameras capturing the stark lines where Miss Cole had invaded. The segment aired at 6 o'clock, featuring my statement about standing up for property rights, about how HOAs sometimes abuse their power. I invited other homeowners in Willow Bend or elsewhere to check their deeds, read their covenants carefully, and never be afraid to fight back if something seems off. The piece ended with a shot of Miss Cole's fence, half torn, a poignant symbol of overreach. The public backlash was immediate and ferocious. Willow Bend residents demanded Ms. Cole's resignation. Some local politicians weighed in, condemning any HOA that tried to seize land under false pretenses. Even the state real estate commission started sniffing around, curious whether these bogus expansions were happening elsewhere. Faced with mounting pressure, Ms. Cole called an emergency board meeting a week later, presumably to decide how to mitigate the damage. I received an email from Mr. Cooper offering a settlement. The HOA would remove the fence from my yard, pay for all damages, and refrain from pursuing any further boundary changes if I'd agree to drop the case. But it was too late for half measures. Not only did I want the fence removed for me, I wanted it removed for Tom, for Carla, for everyone else they'd wronged. So I responded that I'd only consider a settlement if the HOA rolled back every fence that intruded on private property, refunded any fines they'd imposed, and issued a formal apology. The thought of Miss Cole being forced to admit her wrongdoing was too sweet to pass up. A few days later, a second hearing took place, this time to finalize the outcome, with overwhelming evidence that the fences were illegal, and with numerous homeowners testifying, the judge ruled in our favor outright. She mandated the immediate removal of the fences and authorized the county sheriff to oversee the process if the HOA resisted. Miss Cole sat in silence, lips pursed tight, as the judge sternly reminded her about the legal ramifications of forging or misrepresenting property documents. Finally, Miss Cole stood and, in a voice that bordered on a whisper, said, "Your Honor, we understand the decision, and we will comply." The court erupted with applause, which the bailiff struggled to silence. For Tom and so many others, it was validation after months of misery. As for Miss Cole, her reign as HOA president collapsed. Within days, she resigned under the weight of scandal, along with half the board. It emerged that Miss Cole had planned to leverage the expanded perimeter to pitch a new commercial development to certain business interests. A secret plan to profit while the homeowners lost slices of their yards. The fiasco cost her whatever political aspirations she might have had in Willow Bend or beyond. Within a month, every illegal fence post came out. Crews arrived to restore yards to their original boundaries. I watched them work from my porch, chest swelling with a quiet triumph. The boards crashed to the ground one by one, revealing the yard I'd known before. Chester wagged his tail excitedly, as if celebrating the newfound space to run around. In the aftermath, the community bonded in a new way. Neighbors realized how easily they could be deceived if they didn't stand up for each other. We formed a new homeowner committee, more transparent and balanced, that truly addressed residents' concerns. Tom replanted his vegetable garden, Carla helped him add new seedlings. The young couple on the next block resumed their backyard renovation, no longer constrained by Miss Cole's imaginary lines. A local newspaper interviewed me about the case, and I made sure to emphasize the moral of the story. Knowledge is power. "I'm thankful we uncovered the fraud before it got worse," I said, "but this never would have happened if folks felt safe to speak up from the start. HOAs serve a purpose when they're honest, but the moment they trample basic property rights, it's our duty to fight back." Life soon returned to a calmer rhythm. My phone still buzzed with occasional calls from other neighborhoods, people who'd seen the story and wanted advice about dealing with questionable HOAs. I helped where I could, sometimes pro bono, happy to empower more homeowners to stand against intimidation. My quiet suburban life was no longer quite so quiet, but in a way that was all right. Justice needed a voice, and if mine could help a handful of people, I was glad to raise it. One late afternoon, I stood at the edge of my yard, now free from that intrusive fence. The grass was still recovering, and I could see the faint outline of where the fence had once stood. Even the daisies I'd planted for my mother were sprouting new buds nearby. Chester bounded through the yard, chasing a butterfly, oblivious to how close we'd come to losing this space. I folded my arms, smiling as the early evening sun cast long shadows across the lawn. For a moment, I thought of Miss Cole's arrogance, how she thought she could hoodwink an entire community under the guise of property improvements. She never saw me coming, never dreamed the neighbor she tried to bully was a seasoned land attorney with a flair for unraveling exactly this kind of scam. Perhaps that was the best twist of all. When you trample on someone's rights, you'd better know who you're dealing with. Miss Cole learned that lesson the hard way. I caught Carla's voice drifting over the fence line. She was chatting with the young couple about future block parties and maybe a community garden to bring everyone together. There was a sense of rebirth in Willow Bend. Like the fences Miss Cole built, had ironically torn down the barriers that once kept neighbors from truly connecting. Maybe that was the silver lining in this entire ordeal. As the evening stretched on, I headed back inside, phone in hand, noticing a few missed calls from prospective clients. The old me, before Miss Cole's fence fiasco, might have let them go to voicemail until Monday. But now I felt a renewed vigor. I'd seen firsthand how vulnerable homeowners could be, how unscrupulous HOAs could exploit even the slightest uncertainty in property lines. I wanted to help. Maybe that was my calling all along, to protect the everyday folks from the manipulations of the powerful. I stepped into my study, setting the phone down and taking a final look at the thick stack of documents I'd used to bring down Unmasked Cole's scheme. My eyes lingered on the email chain that started it all, the smoking gun of her fast-track plan. A small smile tugged at my lips. Sometimes, justice comes down to a single piece of evidence, a single shred of truth that sets off a chain reaction no amount of intimidation can stop. Outside, the last glimmers of sunlight danced on the grass where that fence had been. Chester barked playfully, chasing after a squirrel, and in that fleeting moment, I felt more at peace than I had in years. Because after all the arguments, all the legal wrangling, after the dust and debris, I had reclaimed my yard, reaffirmed my neighbor's rights, and reminded an entire town that justice still matters. But there was another, deeper victory, one I could practically taste in the quiet hush of twilight. Miss Cole had built her fence through my yard in the belief that she held all the cards, that she could bully me with half-truths and scare tactics. She never suspected I was more than a sleepy suburbanite. She certainly never imagined I'd peel back her lies and expose her game to everyone. And I'm certain she never dreamed I'd stand victorious in the center of my yard while her prized fence ended up in splintered ruins. So yes, the Willow Bend HOA built a fence through my yard, but they soon discovered they'd tangled with the wrong man. They learned, too late, that you can't just trample on a high-powered land attorney's property without facing devastating consequences. And that, as far as I'm concerned, is the best lesson Ms. Cole could ever learn. Sometimes, the biggest fences make the hardest falls, and there's no fence tall enough to keep out the truth when it finally comes crashing through. Thank you for listening. If this story struck a chord with you, share it with someone who might need the reminder that standing up for what's right, especially in your own backyard, can echo far beyond any fence line an unscrupulous HOA might dare to build.